When you think about places you want to go on vacation, what comes to mind first? A tropical beach, basking in the warm sun, sipping on a watered-down drink that some underpaid child worker made for you at the all-inclusive resort you're staying at? Or maybe you think of exploring ancient ruins of a bygone age, like Indiana Jones if he rode in a bus with no roof and a tour group of 40 people. What about going on vacation in an active war zone? You might have to switch hotels every night or two due to unplanned deconstruction projects, but the accommodations are cheap. And you might see some unique sights like bank runs, embassies being abandoned, the government fleeing the country, and some friendly locals setting up roadside tourist information booths just so you can stop and talk to them. This type of trip might not be for everyone, but to one university student from Birmingham, England, it sounded like a dream. The only problem was, he might have picked the worst time to visit Kabul since Genghis Khan besieged the place. The Afghan government crumbled and the Taliban took control of the country by force, all during Miles' first trip there. Over the course of the next couple of years, Miles' enthusiasm for unique holidays would bring him notoriety, adventure, and some cool Taliban sneakers. But this would all come to a screeching halt when Miles unexpectedly stopped answering his phone and social media during another trip to Afghanistan in 2023. At first, people suspected he had died or been kidnapped for ransom, but eventually it was learned that he was alive in Kabul. He had been arrested by the Taliban secret police and taken to an Afghan prison.
3 British men are being held in Taliban custody in Afghanistan, including so-called danger tourist Miles Routledge, who returned to the country after being evacuated by British armed forces less than 2 years ago.
No one was sure what he was charged with, how long he would be there, or if he would even get out alive at all. This is the story of how Miles Routledge from Loughborough University became Lord Miles of Afghanistan. But before we get into that, let me ask you a question. Have you ever wanted to smell really good and then realize that you just don't? That's why I'm proud to let you know that this video is sponsored by Scentbird. Scentbird is a fragrance subscription that lets you try a new designer fragrance each month for just $17. And they were nice enough to send me a few to try just for this video. You can see how cool the packaging is. I'll show you what it looks like when you open it up. This is one of the containers from Scentbird, and I'll show you when you open these, there is a really generous portion of fragrance in there. You are definitely getting a great value with this. The first one that they gave me to try is Scents of Wood by Hinoki and Hinoki. It's got some really cool scents like white thyme and hinoki oil and some other spices I can't pronounce, but what I can pronounce is that it smells really good. Another fragrance they sent me is signed by Mercedes-Benz, and I really like this one. It smells like grapefruit, lavender, and some other citrusy flavors. It's got some great floral notes to it. And one of the best things about Scentbird is that it lets you experiment with different fragrances and figure out which one suits you best. Scentbird subscriptions are flexible and you can skip a month or cancel anytime, so there's absolutely no hassle. And there's over 600 perfumes and colognes to choose from, including unisex options. So no matter what your taste is, you can be sure you're getting a premium fragrance each month. With Scentbird, you get a 30-day supply of each fragrance you choose so that you don't have to fully commit to a bottle of fragrance, which full size could cost up to $150 to even $300. So head on over to Scentbird's website and use my promo code Jabroni for 55% off your order. It's just a little over $7 for your first month. Thanks to Scentbird for sponsoring this video. Now let's get right back to the story. Friday the 13th, August 2021. Someone calling themselves Miles on 4chan posted, "Decided to pop down to Afghanistan for a few days. Never been before. Just goofing off and soaking in the sun. Seems more peaceful than London to me. Ask me anything." Other people in the thread were understandably suspicious and demanded proof. Miles replied by posting pictures of his flight itinerary, showing that he had in fact flown to Afghanistan that day, the same week that the United States was expected to announce the withdrawal of all its troops from the country. Even if that happened, the Afghan government had been supplied enough American weapons and training over the last 20 years to maintain stability in the country and ensure that an organization like the Taliban couldn't just take over the country. Miles was safe. Probably. Shortly thereafter, President Biden announced that the United States was in fact withdrawing all of its troops, and all hell broke loose. Countries from all over the world began evacuating their embassies in Afghanistan, and skirmishes broke out in remote towns in the countryside. The Taliban was making a move to take the country. Meanwhile, Miles was still posting, and one commenter asked him if he was one of the 600 UK troops sent to evacuate British citizens in the country, adding, "I was originally predicting that Kabul would be surrendering in 6 months. I think it will be sooner than that at the pace things are progressing." Miles said, "Nope, I'm a student at Elborough University and I'll be here for 5 days. I don't believe they'll take the capital for a good week or two, so plenty of time." Some people in the thread maintained a level of skepticism, but others told Miles he was just going to die. Some thought he was oblivious to the news and what was going on there, but Miles corrected them, saying, "The reason I came is because of the news. I googled the top 10 most dangerous countries in the world and used it like a shopping list." Even though the Taliban was advancing faster than anyone had anticipated, Miles refused to change his travel plans, saying, "Tickets are non-refundable. Therefore, I either stay permanently in a grave or I leave on the 19th as planned." Just the Afghanistan grind set. But Miles had a backup plan just in case the Taliban did kidnap him. He showed the people in the thread that he had gotten the title Lord printed on his credit cards by buying a fake certificate and wearing a suit to the bank to get his cards updated. Now, I'm not saying he used established titles for this, but all his descriptions of how he did it sound like he used them to become a Lord. Maybe it wasn't a scam after all? Miles reasoned that a captured Lord would hold more negotiating power than a random university student, saying, "Let's hope it won't get to that stage though." The next day, Miles took several photos posing with abandoned military equipment as proof he was actually there, along with reviews of some of the finest Kabul cuisine. While Miles was posting food reviews on a Mongolian basket weaving forum, the Taliban was closing the noose on the city he was in. They were capturing villages within 70 kilometers of Lord Miles at that moment, and US intelligence revised their estimate that Kabul would not fall in 90 days, but actually 72 hours. Some people in the thread asked to see pics of Miles' hotel room, but he replied that he was staying in a safe house and didn't want to compromise it. Miles had hired a local tour guide to act as his interpreter, and rather than abandoning Miles to look after himself like any sane person probably would do when a bunch of guys with Toyotas and AKs start to topple the government, Miles' interpreter stayed with him, helping him find the safe house. Miles said it was a 5-minute walk to the UK embassy, so if all goes wrong, he could just go for a swift-paced walk and get evacuated.
We start with breaking news now. Taliban fighters have reached the Afghan capital, Kabul. Some reports say they've begun entering the city, but a spokesman for the militants said that they'd been told to wait. The Afghan presidential palace has tweeted that gunshots have been heard at a number of points around Kabul.
While the Taliban surrounded the city on August 15th, Miles was still doing some tourism. He had called ahead to the police and army, who told him it was still safe to do so. During his morning drive around the city, Miles saw some sights like car crashes, bank runs as the country's economy collapsed in real time, and the military abandoning their posts. Upon returning to the safe house, Miles determined that it was time to execute his foolproof plan of simply walking to the British embassy. It had been completely evacuated and closed permanently overnight. As a backup plan, he would walk to the Kabul airport and book a flight. There are probably some good seats left on British Airways, right? Maybe he could even score a free upgrade to business class with his Lord title. He began the 1-hour walk to the airport wearing a headscarf, posing as his interpreter's wife. Once at the airport, Miles learned that there was no one there who knew what was going on or how to get out. There were no more scheduled flights out of the country. He started the long walk back to the safe house to have a nice cold pint and wait for this all to blow over. Once he got there, he started streaming on Twitch.
Okay, how long to the flight? No idea. I have no idea. I'm not too sure if the flight's even happening. I might have to have a military evac. So like, there's loads of helicopters overhead. Oh! I just heard a whirring noise like a firework, or it might be a missile. So it's my one opportunity to go on like a mad lad adventure. Basically, this is just white boy summer right here.
While Miles was putting on a brave face for 4Chan in the stream, he posted later that night on Facebook that he was having a mental health crisis. He couldn't drink water, he couldn't sleep. He had seen too many dead people in the streets. His face in the mirror looked distorted. He didn't have anywhere else to go if the Taliban discovered the safe house. There was no one coming to save him. The next morning, someone came to save him. According to Miles, SAS operators visited the safe house. They quickly warmed up to Miles and shared their alcohol with him. It was his first time drinking anything stronger than Earl Grey. Then they slapped some body armor on Miles, handed him a rifle, and evacuated everyone to a new safe house. Miles posted that the United States military had taken back the airport, but that it had been breached again. He could hear gunshots and fighting throughout the city. Little did Miles know how bad the situation at the airport had actually gotten. Every Afghan person who had ever helped the government or NATO troops in their families knew exactly what the Taliban would do to them if they captured them. Many people desperately clung to planes that were already full to the brim with refugees and wounded fleeing the carnage. People were even handing their babies over the walls to Allied troops in the hopes that they could be saved from what was about to happen. Back on 4chan, Miles had stopped posting. People speculated that he may already be dead or stranded in the country with no way out. The next day, on August 17th, Miles posted that he had gotten on a list of passengers to fly to Dubai. A few hours later, Miles posted video proof that he had escaped from inside one of the transport planes. He had finally made it out of Afghanistan. But it wasn't exactly a clean escape for everyone involved. On the night Miles did the Twitch stream from the safe house, he also took phone calls from a lot of reporters. One of these reporters asked Miles the name of the interpreter who had been helping him, and Miles gave it. The reporter then published the interpreter's full name in an article explaining how he had helped Miles flee the country. Remember those people clinging onto planes because they thought the Taliban knew that they had helped Westerners? Well, there were no more evacuation planes left, and Miles' interpreter was presumed to be stuck in the country at the Taliban's mercy. Luckily, a YouTuber called Rimi Down Under reached out to the website that published the article and got them to take it down. But the Taliban used the internet too. In fact, they were already complaining about the drudgery of working 9-to-5 office jobs instead of fighting a war against the government and goofing off at amusement parks. In between filing TPS reports and attending meetings that could have been emails, the Taliban had probably seen the article. Miles was at a crossroads in his life. He could go back to university and just pursue the investment banking career that he had been after, and it seemed like he might do just that. But the allure to travel somewhere dangerous again was calling him, and he couldn't ignore it. Miles decided he had to come up with a solution to rescue the interpreter who had saved his life. It wasn't going to be easy, and it would be extremely dangerous and expensive, but Miles started planning in secret to get his interpreter out of Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. South Sudan, December 2021. A 7-year civil war had officially ended the year before, but violence between armed militia groups never stopped, and according to some, had only gotten worse by this point. Over 400,000 people had died from combat and war crimes. So naturally, Miles had to go there. In December of 2021, just 4 months after being at the fall of Kabul, he traveled to Africa for some more danger tourism and his own brand of charity. Miles had spoken about his distrust of traditional charity organizations and their mishandling of money, so his plan was to get to distressed places and just hand out cash. Leave it to an investment banking student to cause as much inflation to the local economy as possible. On the way out of England, Miles was interrogated on suspicion of terrorism, causing him to miss his original flight. After 40+ hours of travel, Miles arrived in South Sudan and immediately went to the dodgy part of Juba. He said the weather was lovely and he was offered a tribal wife. He never did say if he accepted or not. Miles said that night he heard gunshots in the street and wanted to ask them kindly to be quiet so he could get some sleep. The next day, he set out to buy some meat for the stray dogs roaming the city. Miles' trip was going swimmingly until a bridge in the city was bombed and the roads out started to be closed. He wondered if he could walk to Kenya and then into Uganda to fly out of the airport there. Just 4 hours after the news of the bombing, the World Health Organization announced that they had dispatched a task force to investigate an unidentified mystery illness that had killed 89 people in South Sudan. Juba was starting to feel like Kabul with extra steps at this point, and to top it all off, apparently Miles' post had enraged someone in Kenya. They emailed Miles saying that they had powerful friends and that he would be arrested at the Kenyan border. Maybe Miles should have just accepted the tribal wife and settled down. The next day, Miles paid a driver who attempted to scam him, but eventually he made it to the airport and out of the country. But Miles didn't leave empty-handed. He had bought several South Sudan patches to sell online, starting a trend that would bring both funding for his ongoing travels and more scrutiny from the postal services than anyone since Ted K. Early in 2022, Miles began teasing a big trip. He started a GoFundMe titled "Help Miles Save Lives" on his biggest trip. The goal was £35,000. As Miles was raising money and preparing for this mystery trip, full-scale war broke out in Europe. US intelligence estimated that Kiev would fall to the Russian army within 96 hours. Whoever's in charge of these estimates should be fired, as they are now 0 for 2. Russian troops quickly advanced as far as the suburbs of Kiev in an attempt to take the capital, but were bogged down in fierce urban combat and ambushes that halted their long supply convoys. So naturally, Miles had to go there. Within a month, Miles had raised money and traveled to Poland. He bought a car along with some food and water to hand out and drove to Kiev. By this point, millions of people were leaving the country in the wake of the ongoing war. The entire country was being bombarded by Russian missiles, attacks from the Russian army, and mercenary armies including roving bands of Chechens and one hot dog salesman turned warlord. Miles crossed the border between Ukraine and Poland several times, ferrying supplies and posing as a journalist. After a couple of days of this, Miles had made contact with a pregnant woman and her children who were attempting to get out of the country. He drove to their city, picked them up, and drove back to Poland. Mission accomplished. Miles reassured his follower that this wasn't the big trip he had been teasing. He was still waiting on documents from a very special country country. It would take multiple months through multiple war zones and nations, and leaking the details could get him executed. By mid-April, Miles had left Ukraine and was on his big mystery trip. He would have to pass through several countries to get there, and on April 22nd, he posted a foreboding message from someone in the country he was going to. The person told Miles the situation was extremely dangerous and pled with Miles to postpone his journey. So naturally, Miles had to go there. The next day, Miles posted an update on his GoFundMe saying that he had made it to the first country. He said the funds were invested wisely and everything was being filmed, and he already had an editor lined up to make a banger video of this trip. Over the next couple days, Miles posted fit pics and food pics, but then on the 25th, something terrible happened. Miles posted a video explaining the situation where he broke down in tears. He revealed that this trip's purpose was to save the Afghan interpreter who rescued him during the fall of Kabul. Miles had made arrangements to smuggle him and his family out of the country, but the interpreter had just told Miles that he didn't want to do it anymore. He didn't want to leave his home. Miles explained in a tweet saying, "I invested over 400 hours and 15,000-ish pounds on saving my tour guide. Now that he's backed out at the last possible minute, he's ruined me. I'm insanely pessimistic right now. Even if I died on this trip, at least I would have died helping someone. I feel empty." Miles hit a low point, tweeting that he wasn't going to be able to afford any more travel. After some reflection, Miles deleted most of the doom and gloom posts and the crying video. He was going to go to Afghanistan anyway. He would enter the country through Pakistan, produce content, and donate the remainder of his money and fly home. Miles noted that this might be his last trip ever. The next day, he set out to Afghanistan. Shortly after crossing the border, he had a meal with local Taliban officials, as you do. Being low on cash in Afghanistan gave Miles an idea. The United States military had left a massive amount of weapons and supplies in the country during their hasty retreat during Miles' last visit. Miles found that he could easily buy these weapons at the market at pretty reasonable prices. While he contemplated becoming the next Merchant of Death, Miles stocked up on dozens of patches, rugs, and flags that he could easily bring back with him to England to sell. Miles didn't save his interpreter, but he did manage to save some very interesting rugs. Miles returned to Afghanistan just a few months later in August, buying even more wares to export, visiting a market with a massive stockpile of guns, and going shooting with the Taliban.
I like it.
Miles' gun safety skills might have been lacking, but his bank account wasn't anymore. He had started a small but growing export business. Miles went back to Afghanistan a fourth time, and by now, he was renting a house in Kabul for the equivalent of $1,000 a month. In early 2023, Miles went back to Afghanistan for a fifth time, but now he had a brand new plan. Miles had read about a gold mine where the Soviets and later Americans had tested and found the area to contain 16 grams of gold per ton. Miles was talking with friends and potential investors about funding a new mining operation at the site. If he could raise enough funding and secure the Taliban's blessing, he had a chance to be next up to do what the British have always done best: resource extraction in faraway lands. Miles is a serial tweeter and has a knack for tweeting stream of consciousness style whatever comes to mind. Some weeks he tweeted 200 to 300 times, but at the end of February 2023, while he was in Afghanistan for this gold mine trip, he just stopped. On March 15th, an account claiming to be the Taliban Public Relations Department said that they had lost contact with Miles after he went on a journey in the eastern part of Afghanistan. They said they had already contacted the British Embassy in Islamabad. The legitimacy of this account was dubious at best, but it did get people wondering, what happened to Miles?
We've got some breaking news now, and details are emerging about 3 British men who are being held in Taliban custody in Afghanistan. They include so-called danger tourist Miles Rutledge, who returned to the country after being evacuated by British armed forces less than 2 years ago.
Miles had been captured by the Taliban. The non-profit humanitarian organization Presidium, who was working to negotiate the release of Miles and 2 other Britons who had been imprisoned around the same time, said they had had no meaningful contact with any of the 3 men. Miles had already been in prison for over a month, and as spring turned to summer with no new updates, people began to speculate that Miles was probably pushing daisies, or poppy flowers. The Taliban doesn't exactly have a pristine human rights record, and a lot of spectators online took smug satisfaction in the thought that someone as brazen about danger as Miles had met a grisly end. But surely the British government was doing everything in its power to save Miles, right?
So you are in negotiations then?
Well, we're always, if there are problems and if there are safety concerns to British individuals abroad, then the SCDO will be working actively to ensure people are safe.
Wow. That was really reassuring. As the internet continued to rumble about Miles being dead, Presidium Network reassured people that the 3 Britons in prison are being treated well, fed decent food, and have activities to pass the time. Any effort needs to be focused on maintaining the welfare of detainees and not creating circumstances where that could be diminished. June turned to July, and anyone holding out hope that Miles was still alive was starting to lose faith. Most had already assumed we would never hear from him again. Then on July 17th, something completely unexpected happened. Miles tweeted. Well, not actually Miles, but someone else on Miles' account. The tweet said, "This is a friend of Lord Miles to give an update. 4 months in Taliban custody. He's treated very well, has several servants, loads of movies on his laptop, goes on picnics, and has tea with the Taliban cabinet government. He still loves Afghanistan." They went on to talk about how much fun Miles was having in custody, quoting Miles as saying, "I haven't been this relaxed in years. Lovely to get away from it all." They went on to end the thread by saying that Miles would sell his exclusive story to a journalist upon his return. They would start the bidding at £5,000. But there were some apparent problems with this post. First, the photo that was posted was old from one of Miles' previous trips to Afghanistan. Second, the style of writing was peculiar. They had already said that they weren't Miles, but who were they really? In the complete absence of proof, many were skeptical. Some even speculated that the Taliban had taken Miles' phone and written the tweet themselves. Was the request for money for the story a thinly veiled ransom attempt? But not all reactions were so negative. Some YouTubers, including Count Dankula, backed up the story in the thread. A week later, on July 24th, whoever was running Miles' account started another thread. This one said that when Miles was arrested for being suspicious, Taliban intelligence GDI read his book as seen in the picture here and liked its contents. Miles also arm wrestled with members of the GDI for fun during questioning and was smiling throughout. They also claimed that the men guarding him were more like servants and that they would get him whatever he wanted, as he was allowed to keep the large sum of cash that he had with him when he was arrested. This sounded more like a story a second grader would tell his classmate about his dad than an actual update on a Taliban prisoner. So the internet remained skeptical. Mainstream news outlets started picking up the story, but details remained sparse. July turned to August, turned to September. Whoever was on Miles' Twitter account continued to try to convince people that they were telling the truth. After the last thread had gone viral, the account was mass reported for impersonation and temporarily suspended. Miles' Patreon was also suspended, as people had reported that too. At the end of September, whoever was running the account said, "Listen, I'm going to level with you guys. If we continue to provide updates, either they aren't believed or get Miles' account suspended. If we don't provide updates, nobody will remember Lord Miles when he's out." Later that same day, they said they wouldn't be sharing any more updates. Maybe we had finally heard the last about Lord Miles. But then on October 10th, Lord Miles' account tweeted again, this time in first person. 8 months in Taliban intelligence custody. Best adventure I've had yet. All the previous tweets are true. Best mates with many top commanders after numerous picnics. Lovely lads treated me as a guest. I will be returning to Kabul next month. Really outdid myself. Why did some of you think I was dead? Why did anyone worry in the slightest? No faith in me. I have pull. Literally was watching the new Barbie movie with the Taliban and saw some of your comments on their phones, all of us snickering. Hee. People immediately asked why he was detained. Miles explained that he didn't get a permit to explore the area that he wanted to open a gold mine. He was meant to be released in 6 months, but the paperwork took another 2 months. The Taliban really were sick of their desk jobs. As soon as he got out of Afghanistan, Miles went on an interview tour, sitting with YouTubers, mainstream media personalities, and the most infamous man in Romania. Miles explained that the day he was arrested, he had gone back to the bank to pull out the money to pay his rent on his house in Afghanistan. When he returned to his car, there were 2 Taliban intelligence officers with rifles who began questioning him. Miles said he was cordial and friendly with these men, and willingly accompanied them to Kabul when they told him they had to take him in for more questioning. The higher-ups in the Taliban were convinced that Miles was a spy, and under questioning, Miles' friend James, who was also arrested with him, told the Taliban what they wanted to hear, that Miles was in fact the next James Bond, in country to bring down the government, steal their women, and crash very expensive cars. This meant Miles had to be detained for longer. As the Taliban went through his cell phone and laptop, they couldn't find any evidence of espionage, but convicted him for 6 months imprisonment for visiting the gold mine site without a permit. This gave them more time to find out if he really was a spy or not. Miles says he was friendly with the men guarding him the whole time, and after they couldn't find any spy stuff on his laptop, they just gave it back to him. He was able to get his hands on several DVDs, which him and the men in the house watched together. He says their favorites were Black Hawk Down and the Titanic. Something about imagining Taliban soldiers getting emotional over the end of the Titanic is truly poetic. Miles says one day, out of the blue, the commander of the house came to Miles and told him he was to be taken to the airport the next day and flown to Dubai, the same destination Miles had flown to 2 years earlier during the fall of Kabul, out of the very same airport. The commander said he would help Miles come back and ensure his safe passage with a document that would allow him free movement within the country. So we may see the investment banking student turned danger tourist running a profitable Afghani gold mine in the very near future. Godspeed, Miles. Godspeed. If you enjoyed this video, you might like my video on how War Thunder players leaked military secrets, which you can watch right here. And a huge thanks again to Scentbird for sponsoring this video. Make sure to click the link in the description to get 55% off your first month. And as always, thanks for watching. Stay weird, internet. See you next time. Peace.